Hey everybody, welcome to our next EV webinar, Your Key to Electrification. This one's going to be all about successful EV infrastructure, so charging, parking lots, charging structures. And I want to go over a few housekeeping items here quick while everybody is logging on. If you've been to our webinars before, this will look very familiar. We're recording this webinar. You should get a link to the recording when the webinar is over after it's done processing, and everybody on the attendee list is going to remain muted. But if you have questions, feel free to type them in the questions chat function, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. There will also be a short survey. We just want to know how we did, and if you have any suggestions for future webinars, we take that into account too. So that is all I have, and I wanted to play a video that kind of intros EcoEngineers before we get into the nitty-gritty of the webinar.
Carbon is the biggest disruptor of the 21st century, and the world as we know it is changing. EcoEngineers can guide you to make the best decisions as you navigate toward your clean energy goals. Our diverse team of carbon analysts, engineers, scientists, auditors, and regulatory specialists are trusted advisors of the clean energy fuel sectors worldwide. Clean energy regulations are a maze. We simplify them with an unbiased approach and fully manage your compliance. Modeling your carbon reduction is complicated. We quantify your emissions with a rigor based in science. Together, we can create markets that will protect and grow your investment. We create sustainable solutions for a better tomorrow. We are EcoEngineers.
Thank you, Lindsay, for kicking us off there. I'm Dan Chacha. I'd like to just follow that video up with a quick overview here of EcoEngineers. Here at EcoEngineers, we have a group of highly talented scientists, engineers, and analysts and consultants who focus on decarbonizing the transportation and energy sector. We assist our clients in a variety of ways. It can be grouped into really 6 main categories, though, shown in this diagram, this wheel on the left. We provide education and customized workshops, engage on clients' behalf with regulatory agencies such as the EPA, CARB, and others. We also perform rigorous life cycle assessments on fuels and fuel pathways. And when it comes to developing assets, we work with clients to provide due diligence analysis, return on investment analysis. We can serve as an owner's advocate or help manage projects as well through development. And then the last 2 areas of our business are compliance and auditing, which you can think of as the accounting firm for your carbon and environmental measurement needs, particularly when it comes to some of the more profitable regulatory programs that we work with you on. And then on the right, you'll see a sampling of fuel types that we work with and our clients develop projects under. We work across all the alternative low carbon fuels, not just electric vehicles, which we'll be focusing on today, but also liquid alternative fuels, low carbon fuels, gaseous fuels. One of the areas that really makes us unique is on the right there is our deep understanding of the government and voluntary regulatory systems, such as the Renewable Fuel Standard, the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, and others. So with that overview, to set the conversation here about EcoEngineers, let's start talking about electric vehicles today. With me today, I have Sarah Caswell. Sarah is a senior regulatory consultant and policy and legal expert at EcoEngineers. She's going to provide an update on the latest programs coming from Washington for EVs and elsewhere. And I'm Dan Chacha, senior regulatory consultant at EcoEngineers. My focus area is in electrification, transportation, as well as smart grid development and renewable energy generation. We'll start today off with a regulatory update from Sarah, and then I want to present to you kind of an overview of the status of the fleet vehicle market today. Are we at a point where electrification is real, or is it more aspirational for fleets? That's a question I hope to answer for you. And finally, I want to spend most of this webinar discussing some of the key considerations if you do choose to electrify your fleet or parts of your fleet, what are some of those key considerations to planning your EV charging infrastructure? So with that, I will pass it over to Sarah to give us a glimpse of the latest on the regulatory front.
Thanks, Dan. I'm so excited to be here today to help kick off this exciting webinar topic. It's very prescient, as we all know, because of what Congress is considering and what President Biden has been working on, along with Congress for the last couple months. I'm excited to talk a little bit about the key role government can play to provide a strong, stable market signal that speeds up and drives investment and growth in EVs and their corresponding infrastructure. In addition, well-crafted public policies at the federal and state levels serve to help incentivize EV manufacturing, consumers to purchase EVs and charge them, and states to build out the necessary charging infrastructure to correspond with the growth of the EV market here and all across the globe. The incentives take many forms, including tax credits for purchasing the EVs, rebates on the registration costs and charging stations, as well as clean fuel standards. And the funding comes from a myriad of sources, including government grants and even settlement funds from litigation, including the 2015 Volkswagen case. Some of you may remember that after admitting that it had illegally violated US emissions rules in 2015, Volkswagen agreed to provide $3 billion to the US to be used by states to replace aging trucks, buses, and marine equipment. Notably, the program does not fund passenger car replacements, but it does support EV charging infrastructure. As I mentioned at the beginning, the key point here is that strong government support for EVs can provide a strong signal to the market of long-term investment stability that can serve to speed up the growth of EVs and their infrastructure. This is especially important in a nascent industry like electric vehicles. It's also important that it was announced just a couple weeks ago during the G7 summit that those world leaders attending that summit will engage cohesively as a group in an effort to ensure that more than half of new passenger cars sold in 2030 will be non-emitting. The leaders didn't offer details on the effort. However, many see it as a step forward and an important cohesive global market signal for EVs. So as I mentioned in the last slide, last Friday, President Biden, along with a bipartisan group of senators, announced that they had reached a deal on an infrastructure package, including $15 billion for EVs. Of that, half would go to infrastructure like charging stations and half to electric vehicles, including buses. Just before Memorial Day last month, the Senate Finance Committee, under the leadership of Debbie Stabenow from Michigan, passed through that committee a tax package that would extend and reform the existing EV tax credit. Among other things, the legislation would provide up to a $12,500 tax credit for EVs built in the US, while also eliminating the existing EV cap. The credit would phase out over 3 years once 50% of all US passenger vehicle sales were EVs. Importantly, versions of both of these federal pieces of legislation are expected to pass Congress and be signed into law by the end of the year. I'll turn over the discussion back to you, Dan, to talk more about EV technology capabilities and how industry can accomplish the task of building out infrastructure alongside this increased government support and investment.
But I just wanted to clarify the summary here. We have $15 billion coming out with the current infrastructure plan, and the potential for quite more in follow-up packages that are going through.
Yeah.
Thanks, thanks, Sarah. There's a lot of information to decompress there. There are a myriad of programs and regulatory incentives. So it's a lot to unwind, and you know, we can help you unwind those as well. So it's changing every day, and it's constantly evolving. So thank you for giving us the update, and that's all really changed since the last webinar we had 3 months ago. So appreciate you staying on top of that. Now we'll so there are a lot of financial and regulatory drivers pushing us towards electrification, but this really only helps you. You know, it's one thing to have the money to invest in electric vehicles, but it only helps you if there's a viable market to purchase these vehicles. So I want to talk a few minutes about what vehicles are available in the market and how this can service your fleet needs. First of all, what do we mean by fleet? You know, a fleet is a group of motor vehicles that is owned or leased by a business, a government agency, or other organization, as opposed to being an individual or family. It can include any kind of vehicle. You know, we think of buses or trucks being a fleet. It can be light duty vehicle, passenger cars, pickup trucks, box trucks, heavy duty vehicles, equipment trucks such as utilities, refuge vehicles. You know, a lot of these are already being converted to other alternative fuels and are also being electrified. And then personal mobility, e-scooters, segways. There are lots of police forces, for example, that have this kind of vehicle as part of their fleet. So it encompasses all sorts of vehicle types to be a fleet. And why do we want to focus on a fleet in terms of this webinar and in terms of infrastructure? If you're a single owner, it's easy to kind of put in an electric vehicle charging station. That makes sense. It's pretty straightforward. But if you're a fleet, you have a lot more complexity. You have a lot more vehicles, use cases. You have a lot more drivers and purposes for these vehicles. You have specific charging needs. You need to charge your vehicles for a certain number of miles the next day or for the next shift. But a couple things about fleets that differ from non-fleets is that fleets oftentimes have very predictable usage patterns, at least with a certain segment of their vehicles. They know how many miles, how long they'll be out, what time they'll be back. Also, fleets are very conscientious about the total cost of ownership, not just the upfront purchase price of a vehicle. So when taking into these things into consideration, electrification starts to make a lot more sense for fleets. When I speak to fleet managers, there are usually 3 main objections to starting to electrify their fleet. The first objection is the total, you know, the cost of vehicles. Sarah presented a great overview of the mosaic of incentives, the different rebates, the credits available. It can be hard to track, but it does bring many EV options to cost parity with their gas and diesel counterparts. So it starts to make that cost differential much smaller. The second objection I often hear is that there are no vehicles available in the class or the type desired. And hopefully we can talk about that here with this slide. So this data comes from CalSTART, and they put together a great graphic here. This shows the number of models of transit buses that are available per year for 2020, 21, 22, 23. Each of those bars, that's the cumulative number of models. So here in 21, we have almost 300 transit bus models available globally on the market today. Now, most of those are in, you know, in orange there for China. The North American models are in green, but still that's about 50 models of transit buses available today in North America. What about other types of fleet vehicles or common fleet vehicles? We might be looking at medium duty trucks. This shows a number of models, quite a few models here for about 75 or 70 models in 2021 in North America alone for medium duty trucks. For heavy duty trucks, there are some dozens available for heavy duty truck in North America and over 50 globally. So there are quite a few, and this is varieties of models available, remember? Cargo vans, fewer number, but still a few dozen cargo van type models. Shuttle buses, there are actually starting to be quite a few shuttle buses, looks like maybe about 30 plus there in North America. Medium duty step vans seems to be the focus market there is North America, and that's dominated by North America. It looks like about 30 models. Same number there for school buses. School buses are really becoming a hot topic in our school systems. Can we electrify the school buses? How do we get off these diesel emissions for the kids? Yard tractors. You wouldn't probably guess that there are a number of models of yard tractors available right now. So it looks like about maybe 20 models of yard tractors. So there are options out there even for off-road applications. And then just a catch-all for the other categories here. So the bottom line is here, there's a lot of models available on the market today. There are more coming out. There's a good variety, and it can serve a number of use cases for your fleet needs. And then the third major objection that I often hear when I discuss fleet electrification is that the range is inadequate for one's purpose. And that may be true for specific use cases, but it may also be that there's plenty of range available for other vehicles within the fleet. So there electrification isn't going to solve every single application today, but it can be the solution for a great many number of applications. This chart shows each mark on the chart represents a vehicle model, and its x-axis here is the range of the models, which is shown in across the top. If you look at really kind of the clustering of most of these vehicles, it's around 150 to 200 miles. There are certainly outliers in either direction, but 150 to 200 miles for most of these types of vehicles is more than sufficient for the application. Certainly a school bus isn't going to go typical routes, are not going to go in excess of those, and local box trucks and things like that, transit buses. So there are a lot of vehicles with this range, and some with outliers with greater range available. So there are lots of funding sources to help with keep the cost competitive for electrification. There are many models to choose from, and most of those models offer a range option that's very capable for most fleet jobs. But as an organization, you still want to have a compelling reason to migrate your vehicles towards electricity. So here are some of the benefits that you may want to consider when looking at your fleet vehicles and whether there might be a good candidate for electrification. There's reduced maintenance cost. Electric vehicles, and it's starting to roll in quite a bit of data on this now. I saw two articles recently, one from the federal government and one from a smaller organization, analyzing the cost difference between gas vehicles and electric vehicles on their fleet, and it's a pretty dramatic cost decrease, about 60% in one case, 60% savings on the maintenance. Having reduced maintenance cost is great. Having the vehicle down for maintenance less is even better. So there's not only fewer dollars spent, but there's actually fewer days that the vehicle's out of commission getting maintenance. So there's less downtime. The vehicles can be used longer or more days per year. These both help the total cost of ownership picture. So there's been a lot said about the lower cost of driving a vehicle mile in an electric vehicle versus a gas vehicle. There is a substantial cost per mile savings just because the electricity versus the gasoline cost is lower, but also when you factor in maintenance cost, that addresses, that brings down the cost of ownership as well. Electric vehicles have reduced noise and vibration. They're nicer to drive in that sense, in terms of those qualities. They can also help you address some of your corporate goals. You may have, some ESG goals, some environment, social, and governance goals for your organization. You may have carbon goals for your organization, or other types of environmental and sustainability goals that you're trying to meet. Electrification can help move the organization towards those goals. EVs are, have increased efficiency. They can help with productivity, reduce driver comfort is increased, therefore it improves the productivity. Drivers are happier and stay on the job longer. And then, of course, the environmental benefits, which would take a whole nother webinar to talk about that. So now I've hopefully given you something to think about in terms of the potential for integrating electric vehicles in your fleet. Let's spend the balance of this discussing the considerations to keep in mind when planning the charging infrastructure. So how will you charge these vehicles if you do want to move them into your fleet? Some of the key considerations that I want to discuss here during this webinar is to talk about power management. How will you get enough power to your vehicles? How will you allocate that power to the vehicles that need it? Vehicle range, how will you manage how far your drivers need to go, how long they have to get to the destination, the time they have available for charging if needed, the routes to accomplish that, and then who can access your charging infrastructure, and how will you secure them or accept payment, how you manage just the access to those stations. And then finally, I just want to end with a discussion on how to pull all of these concepts together to make an EV charging infrastructure plan for your organization. So let's chat about some of the power considerations. First, kind of as a review, if you've seen sort of tables of the different charge levels before, there are really 4 different types of charging today. And the first 2 there, level 1 and level 2, are AC charging, alternating current. Level 1 there is a very slow charge. It's down in the noise and doesn't deliver much power per hour. It's not really a practical solution at all for fleets, so we won't really discuss level 1 charging. Level 2 charging is a bit faster, can put about maybe 10 to 25 miles or more into a vehicle per hour of charge. So it's good for light duty vehicles and medium duty vehicles that have a long period to charge, like overnight charging in a depot, for example. Or if you have a lot of distributed locations for your vehicles to get charging when needed. And then on the right, wireless is an interesting emerging standard that is comparable to level 2 charging in terms of the power it can deliver. And what's interesting about that is in 2020, the standards bodies all agreed on a worldwide protocol or worldwide standard for how to do wireless charging. So that is a big step forward. They agreed on 3 power levels, and that's a good step forward for wireless charging. I'm sure there'll be a lot more activity in that space in the coming years. It's not really a big charging technology today, but as autonomous vehicles emerge, it will become more and more important not to have to plug a cord in to charge a vehicle, but to just be able to rest over a charging pad. So we'll actually talk about that a bit more in the 3rd webinar in our series in 3 months from now. Really, the charging format I want us to focus on a bit here is the DC fast charging. And that's the large bar in the middle represents a big wide range of charging power capabilities. And that really goes from sort of on the low end from about 35 kilowatts of power delivered all the way up to 120 or more, depending on technology. But the point is here is a DC charger can charge a light duty vehicle about 80% charge in about 20 minutes. So they can be very fast turns on the charge. They're good for charging high duty vehicles, buses, or in any place that needs high turnover charging. So if you're sharing charging between a lot of light duty vehicles and you want to get them in and out quickly, DC can be a great alternative. They're more expensive and they're more complicated in terms of installation. So let's talk about that for a bit. Electric distribution is at one site. Kind of looks like this. Here's a simple diagram showing the connection of this site to the grid. The substation brings power in. There's some oversupply protection, a step-down transformer, a meter, and then the power available for charging. Also, sites may have some on-site generation, such as PV, solar, wind turbines, and it may even have on-site storage. So there's some different configurations that could exist here. And this is assumed you would be also tied to perhaps a building or some other functions as well, not just the parking lot chargers. To give you an idea of kind of what we're talking about, if you have a heavy duty truck and it drives 120,000 miles a year, you may need the equivalent of 22 households of power, just to give you an idea of scale. So if you have several of those trucks, it means you need to do some planning to build up the capacity for your DC chargers. So is your transformer large enough? How much power can the utility actually bring to your site? Just because you want a lot of power doesn't mean you can get it. What's the use case of your vehicles? When do they need to charge? When do they need to leave and go drive? And then what is the rate structure of the electricity? This kind of transformation only makes sense if the electricity is available and affordable. So we'll discuss some of the strategies for this in the coming slides. Maybe a centralized approach like the one shown here. We have a kind of a depot with a lot of charging makes sense, or maybe a more distributed approach. We have a lot of smaller charging, satellite charging areas. And then, or you could even integrate public or charging that's shared with other organizations that have some charging infrastructure is also another way to accomplish this. So there's a lot of different, and you could have a blended model of the different options as well. So one technique to manage the power, you need this power to be delivered, but you don't necessarily want to deliver it on demand when the vehicle kind of rolls in. One technique to manage that is to charge vehicles, is to schedule the charging of those vehicles until there's an optimal time. Here's a couple of scenarios. The chart on the top shows a utility that charges different rates for a kilowatt hour based on the time of day that you use it. So they want to move you to away from using power when everyone else is using power, essentially. So they give you a discount, those green bar areas. As a charging station operator, owner, you can, or fleet operator, you can elect to schedule your charging in those green areas and have a lower cost overall of running your fleet. The chart on the bottom shows another scenario where most organizations have what's called a peak power contract that allows them to take as much power as they want, but if they exceed peak power, then they get a financial penalty for that, and it's usually a pretty strict financial penalty. So if your usage curve for your organization looks like that curve there in blue, and there are times of day that it's getting pretty close to that peak power, you definitely don't want to do your charging then. So you could schedule your charging so that it talks to your meter or talks to your building management system or works based on time of day to determine the best time to charge so that it's avoiding those peak power charges. Another scenario here that I want to present is this is an example that has 6 fleet vehicles. They've arrived back at their central depot for the night. They're in various states of charge. The red vehicles need more time to charge than the yellow vehicles. They also need to leave at different times in the morning, as shown by where they are on this slide. So they can't be all charged at once when they come in because there's only, in this example, there's only 2 available to charge it at the same time. So we can only charge 2 vehicles at a time. How might we do that? If we just plugged them all in, it'd be first come, first serve. It may not be the right order for them going out. So we probably want to charge that one that's leaving earliest and needs the most charge time. Those 2 vehicles would be charged first. The next one would be the next one that's, you know, the truck that needs a long charge and is leaving next. That vehicle would probably be the next one to charge. And then finally, even though that last truck needs quite a bit of charge, it could be charged later because it is leaving so much later. This is a type of scenario that you wouldn't want someone to be moving plugs around and managing necessarily on the floor, but you can do it electronically, programmatically, by having vehicle identities and different plans in your system for managing the charge for these vehicles. Alternatively, you may want a fairer algorithm that sort of staggers the charging but still meets the needs of those vehicles leaving. So that same scenario could just be incorporated with a different type of algorithm that charges them all a little bit at a time but gives priority to those that need it most. Small example just to kind of show you the different strategies available that you may have across your organization. And this allows you to manage your power, manage how much of your power gets used so you don't exceed that peak value, that peak power that I mentioned, or that you can move your power to the cheaper times to charge. Finally, under power, I want to mention that microgrid integration is an important and emerging concept here. So there is a potential of developing sort of an isolated small grid around your charging needs and in your organization. So microgrid is a privately managed grid that's on a small scale rather than a utility that's a large grid. It often contains some on-site power generation such as wind or solar, although it could even be fossil type production as well. It often has energy storage such as a battery storage system shown in the image here, or maybe a flywheel storage system or something else. It's efficient because you have the loads and the devices are all smart, meaning that they can communicate with each other and adjust their behavior. So for example, if it's a hot day and the air conditioner is using a lot of power, as is most of the country right now, as I speak, another system such as your hot water heating or maybe your EV charging could be deferred until a later time of day when there's more power available. So that allows these devices to all talk to each other to understand, so they can understand who needs the priority for that power so that you don't overload. Or often you want to you want to look at just optimizing where you're using your electricity that's most cost effective, but also could be the cleanest sources as well. So in this small, simple scenario, you've got PV, you've got battery, and you've got utility power as 3 different sources of power at any given time. You can use this microgrid kind of approach to use the cleanest power available at any time. So the second category that I want to get into is range. And this is, you know, after you figure out how you are able to get enough power into your vehicles, how to manage the range so that those vehicles get by what they need to do on their charge, or how to manage the recharging for those vehicles. The concerns about range are a little bit different for a fleet, but still very, very important. So they're different, I mean, from say an average consumer who is very unpredictable in where they're going to be driving at any given time. A fleet has kind of different concerns about range. So there's still some range anxiety for fleet, the notion that EVs can only drive a certain distance on a charge, and will that distance be enough? There is the concern about how long it will take to charge the vehicle. You know, if there isn't a DC fast charge available and you need to have a longer time sitting at a level 2 charging station, does that work into the plans for the fleet? Will there be a charger available? And what is the overall cost of this solution? So some of the ways that you address those concerns are to understand those use cases for each vehicle. So there'll be some use cases that are much better candidates for electrification than others. I'm not going to claim that every vehicle today could be replaced by an electric vehicle and not disrupt the way that vehicle is used. So some vehicles are natural fits for EVs today. Some work very well but might need small adjustments, and others are more challenging to, other use cases can be more challenging to electrify. So really understanding the use cases and which ones are best to electrify. How fixed are the routes? How deterministic are those distances? And then planning around those answers to determine those charging needs. Do you need to install or at least identify existing charging infrastructure to address them? And then as far as cost, we talked up front there, Sarah provided a lot of information on the advantages of incentive programs and how many are out there today. So that is solvable as well. It just needs to be unwound a bit for specific cases and specific purposes. So I want to talk about this. The first case study I want to present here is Lafayette Limo provided this to us. So shout out to them. Did a study with Purdue University. And the goal of this study was to determine if an electric vehicle can be used as a shuttle service. So the specific case here, this is an aerial view of Purdue University in the kind of foreground of this picture. And in the background of this picture is an airstrip. And on that airstrip is a small academic building for the aeronautical classes, and they have a need to provide 18 hours of on-demand service to students who need to get back and forth to those buildings. So the distances per day varied. The 18-hour service time required 2 driver shifts. They did this program with a 2018 Tesla Model 3 with the long range option, and they studied how it behaved in various weather and driving conditions. So it was an interesting study because it really got to the root of the question as to whether it can be used for an application like this. So they were very detailed, and in their study used the Tesla Phi analytic dashboard, which provides routes and elevation and weather and temperature, all that data combined in one source. And they had daily mileage over the period of the study was between 56 and 256 miles. So some days were kind of pushing the higher end of what the range of that Tesla can do. And they had the one big caveat was they only had a charging station back at Lafayette Limo, not on campus. So they needed to leave the depot location with a full charge and not have any charging during the day. So what they found was they averaged about 2.7 miles per kilowatt hour. The bottom line is they successfully met the project requirements. They were happy with the performance. They were able to provide the on-demand shuttle service. They did have a couple lessons learned which were interesting, that the cold weather affected the performance and they needed to make some adjustments, but it didn't affect it because of the battery. It affected it because the drivers were heating the cabin in a traditional vehicle way, using the cabin heating. So they needed to sort of adjust how they did that and use the seat heating instead of the cabin heating. And so kind of lessons learned, but essentially it was able to fulfill the tasks that they needed and provide those 18-hour shifts on a single charge. The second case study here I want to present is this is a mid-sized city that a cab company put together this rollout of electric vehicles. The goal here is to electrify taxi service and use electric vehicles instead of gasoline vehicles. So taxi vehicles need to be available 24/7. They're on demand. They have unknown routes and unknown distances. And is that appropriate for an electric vehicle? One might say it's not when you look at that description, but they found out something very different. So they leased 20 Tesla Model 3s. There were grants available and incentives. And the solution that they came up with was to install 6 amenity and fueling centers around the periphery of the city. instead of having a traditional taxi type of arrangement where you have a central depot. The amenity centers provided Tesla fast charging stations at each of those 6 locations. 3 of those locations were actually in municipal library lots, which was an interesting way to avoid having to find space inside of expensive real estate areas, inside of highly populated areas. And it also utilizes a public parking lot and provides a public amenity for that parking lot. So it's a great win for both sides there. The results are that they had a demand for these rides, higher level of service. They were able to have measurable maintenance benefit from the lower maintenance of the vehicles. So reduced maintenance costs, but also reduced vehicle downtime. The charging impact reduced to really didn't impact it that much. So the thought was that perhaps there would be a lot of time off the road to charge, but getting a couple of 20-minute charging sessions per shift really aligns kind of with when drivers would need to take breaks anyway. And overall, they found that they had less than half a cost per mile over a gas vehicle. So it was a successful implementation of electrification for an application that isn't necessarily obvious that it would be appropriate for electrification. The last category I want to get into here is access and control. Who can access those chargers? Are they going to be open access for anyone? Will they need to be RFID or mobile apps to access them? There's a new protocol called auto charge that can identify vehicles. You can have all sorts of payment options. Maybe you want to put them behind physical gates and controls. So these are questions that you'd want to kind of go through as you're planning your infrastructure and charging strategy. Also, to consider how to network these chargers. What will be the connectivity to, where you need to trench for copper and communications, or have cellular or Wi-Fi. The charging network is a choice between different charging networks out there. It's a competitive environment, and there are several out there. And then it's encouraged to always kind of monitor and see how these stations are being used, and understand the usage patterns, so that you can adapt and maybe change policies, or maybe add stations, or maybe need stations in different locations that are in higher demand. So there's a lot that can be learned, and it's an iterative process. Which really brings us to the final section here, and that is how to pull this all together and plan for this transition. So the first thing you'd want to do as a fleet owner, fleet operator, is to assess the fleet needs. So how many vehicles do you have today? How many miles are each vehicle driven? The range for those vehicles? When are they available to charge? How long can they charge? You also want to plan for redundancy, so there's failure, in case of failures. What power is available in what locations, so that you want to minimize your kind of build out. And then the proximity to power, so that you're close to those power sources. So all of those, you want to assess the fleet, assess what you have for use cases, determine which ones are best for electrification in the present, and also look at future and where you might be from there. And then determine the infrastructure. Will you have centralized depots or campuses that are more distributed? Do you have a large organization across multiple cities? What are the public and shared options? Maybe you can work with another organization to build out charging options. And again, you want to always look at what are your present needs, but also what will they look like 5-10 years and beyond. Pulling those together, your fleet needs on your vehicles, and then the needs to satisfy those vehicles, to charge those vehicles, go into developing the plan. The vehicle and fuel mix that you'll have, you're not going to be all electric on day one. So what are the different fuel mixes? You might have 2, 3, or more different alternative fuels. What's your charging strategy going to look like as you electrify those vehicles? Running the economics and the total cost of ownership. Does it meet your sustainability goals for the organization? the ESG goals, the carbon goals, and then measure, adjust, grow, have the ability to evolve this this plan as you get more information and data. So at EcoEngineers, we can help you with all of these areas. We'd be happy to talk to you further, provide you with more information on any of the data that we presented today, as well as work with you on identifying some of these needs and in your infrastructure. So we have kind of the way we've set up our organization. We have you know, planning functions. We can help you assess your fleet and your infrastructure, and do all of those things to feed into developing your plan and ultimately developing your project. And then the other thing we offer here at EcoEngineers is we do manage the compliance and monitor on those regulatory programs that I mentioned. So if there are carbon claims or environmental attributes that are of value here, we can help assist you in making sure you capitalize on those, on that value as well. So with that, I will move us into the Q&A portion here and take any questions that have come in.
Thanks, Dan. That was a lot of great information. We have a couple questions here that have to do with the EV tax credit, the federal EV tax credit. One of them is, how can fleet managers tap into that $7,500 EV tax credit? And then the other one is, what about fleet managers at nonprofits? How can, at like colleges and universities, how can they tap into that?
Those are really good questions. Well, it sounds like the existing tax credit is on track to be reformed. It hasn't been reformed yet formally because it's just been passed through the Senate Finance Committee. So it needs to go through the Senate, the House, and then signed by the president to be the new version. The existing version, I have to admit, I'm not a tax expert on the EV tax credit. And so I would like to answer your question specifically for your specific organizations, but I can't at this moment, and I'd rather get it right. Why don't you get their email addresses, and we'll do the research between Dan and me, and we'll get back to them within the next day or two.
There's another question. What about passenger fleet vehicles? I think that's kind of included, Dan, with all of your fleet conversations. And I assume they mean taxis and.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of light duty passenger vehicles in fleets. Like sales forces have, you know, a lot of sales folks going out in light duty vehicles and inspectors, and I mean, it's a common vehicle in fleets. It's not just the larger vehicles. So, and it's a really natural fit for electrification, especially if you have fairly predictable mileage patterns, and you know when the cars are going to be dormant for charging. Really perfect fit there. The total cost of ownership you'll find is lower than a gas vehicle. The experience will often be higher. It's probably one of the better fits actually for electrification.
Did you guys have anything else you wanted to talk about in terms of infrastructure, EV charging, before we log off here? We covered a lot. I will say that I'm going to put here in the chat for everybody who's still here the link to our previous webinar that kind of just laid out the basics of electric vehicles. In case you're interested in that, you can always find it on our website and our blog as well.
And I just a reminder, we will have our third installment of this webinar series in a couple of months, Q3, and that will cover advanced technologies and some of the emerging things that are being talked about in the industry.
All righty, well, thank you everybody for attending, and we'll be in touch with more EV stuff coming at you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your time.